Hello everyone. So let's start talking about hydration and what is the best way probably to start talking about anything other than starting with some questions. What if water was a nutrient? What if people were drinking according to guidelines? What if most people were well hydrated? And what if water was the fluid of choice? So this is something that we will answer hopefully by the end of the semester. So what is very interesting is that even though we know that our body is made primarily out of water, more than 50% of our body, it is water. Water is the least studied element in nutrition. And not only it's the least studied, it's something that has been, what I like to say, forgotten quite often. So let's give you a little bit of historic background about dietary guidelines in the US, and actually the data are quite similar internationally. USDA has been around for more than 150 years, and every few years have been issuing dietary guidelines for consumers. So things that are memorable, they're created usually in a diagram or a series of pictures and trying to help people to memorize or to remember what are the basic guidelines on how people drink and eat, supposedly. So those guidelines came out first in 1947. They were first called the Basic Seven. And as you can see here in the circle, they had 7 different groups from greens and fruits and vegetables and grains, etc. But if you look carefully, you will see that there is no water anywhere in this group. If you go later on in the guidelines, they were called the Basic Four from 1956 to 1992. There was an effort to simplify the guidelines and have just 4 categories, the Basic Four. And there was a category with what was called fruits and vegetables in one category, a category that was called grains, a category called dairy, and one more category that was like the main animal sources like fish and meats. And of course, again, there is no water in this guidelines. 1992 was the first time that the pyramid was introduced, and even though in the United States we moved away from the pyramid as a way to present dietary guidelines, the pyramid has been probably the single most popular scheme or way to present guidelines across the world, and many countries still use a version or a sort of pyramid. So in 1992, the pyramid was designed with an idea to have the base of the pyramid supposed to be composed of things that we're supposed to eat more often and in larger quantities, and moving to the top, there were things that we're supposed to consume in smaller amount and more sparingly. And as you can see here, we have fats, oils, and sweets in the very top. And we have down on the bottom bread, cereal, rice, pasta group, etc. 6 to 11 servings per day. Which I'm not going to comment on that. This is a different conversation right now. But the point that I'm trying to make is that, again, we didn't have any water. 2005, I got excited for a few seconds. Dietary guidelines were, I was already actually a professor in 2005, and I remember when the guidelines came out, for a second I thought that one of those glasses here must have been water. And the simple answer is no. That was like representing milk and dairy products. So instead of having top to bottom approach, just because top of the pyramid seems to be usually something which is very special, and on the top of the pyramid, people think that you usually put the best of the best. They decided instead of having top to bottom approach, they use this slices more like skinny pizza slices, that you had grains, vegetables, fruits, milk, meat, and beans. Um, and the thickness of this of the slices indicate the amount or the quantity that you're supposed to consume. So anyway, in 2011, this is the year that they really got super excited, thinking that this circle here represented water, which is not the case. 2011, the My Plate was introduced, which is, by the way, a little bit of a random information. My Plate is the single most recognizable document that the United States government has ever published, ever. So the idea was to make it really, really simple. You look at your plate and you see exactly what you're supposed to eat and how much as far as quantity or ratio between other things. However, again, there was no water. There was a circle here that indicated dairy. So I'm not sure what is the blue dairy, whether it's a blueberry yogurt or, I don't know, blue magic meal or something. I can spend a lot of time going over like details, etc. Just very quickly, I'll show you a few more data regarding the 2015-2020 dietary guidelines that they came out with primary emphasis in decreasing sugar consumption, simple sugars and simple carbohydrates, and switching from consumption of sodas to water. So what I did, I went to the website with the data, I open up the search bar and I enter the word water, and I got 4 results for word water. One of them is a definition of what is calorie. So increasing the temperature of 1 kilogram of water by 1 degree centigrade, etc. The second and the third one was referring the importance of switching sodas for water, and water being the fluid of choice versus sugary drinks that contain calories and sugars. And my favorite actually was the number 4, and I emphasize it here. It says, wash your hands with soap and water. So not orange juice. Don't get confused. You need to use running water to wash your hands. Things unfortunately still are not way better. We had the 2020-2025 dietary guidelines that were published a couple years ago. And even there are not specific guidelines about water intake outside of the very specific mention for infants, whether they need to supplement their diet with water and whether breast milk or formula is enough to maintain good hydration. So, hold on and things get even more interesting. So let's go to a conference, for example, and try to submit a scientific presentation in the area of hydration and trying to find a section where it's supposed to be included. It's really, really hard to find something that really matches. Unless you're going to one of those conferences that are specifically addressed for athletes, where hydration and electrolyte balance during exercise, it's a very popular area. So let's go to a journal trying to publish something. Like here I have just a few examples of quite popular journals and trying to submit something. Usually they ask you what thematic area you want to be within the journal. And this is something also very difficult to find. I have to admit that I have tried over the years to help on this direction. And in the European Journal of Nutrition that I am one of the section editors, I have included an area for water. So if you publish there and you have hydration data, it can go to the right category. And also we just recently started a section in the journal Nutrients, which is called Hydration. And I'm the editor-in-chief in that journal, and I'm very proud of it. So with that being said, I like to come back to water as a forgotten nutrient. It's a nutrient that everybody agrees that without water we cannot survive. But on the other side, it's something that has been a little bit misunderstood, has not been studied extensively, and we know very little, which actually it's not that bad for somebody who likes to study hydration. Lots of work to be done and a lot of new things to be explored. So let's start talking about what happens after we drink. Let's explore a little bit how body fluids are balanced. So first of all, when we drink, water goes through the GI system. So we have water transferred into the stomach, and we have from there gastric emptying. So the stomach empties the fluid and it moves to the GI system, to the thin intestine, and it starts getting absorbed. And the water gets absorbed in the blood, or to be perfectly honest, it gets primarily in the plasma, in the watery part of the blood. So blood is, let's say, to simplify, about 50% of blood is about cells, so mainly red cells and a few white cells. That they also have some water, but the other 50% of blood is water. It's plasma. So plasma is the watery part of the blood that doesn't have cells, but it has all those things that we typically measure when we do a blood analysis. So hormones, electrolytes, proteins, and a lot of other things. All of those are diluted in the plasma. So plasma is not that big. It's about 3.5 liters, or approximately 1 gallon. And then from the plasma, it is transferred in ISV, or interstitial volume, or interstitial fluids, which is a few times bigger. It's about 4 times bigger than the amount of water in the plasma. And then from the interstitial space, it is transferred into the cells, or ICV, intracellular volume. So most of the water is within the cells. This is how we lose water. We lose water by evaporation. So through the sweat glands, we have water coming on the surface of the skin, and then when the water comes in the surface of the skin, it either get evaporated or it drips, and based on that, we're able to thermoregulate. We'll talk extensively about this process later on in this course. And we also lose water through urination. So we pee out mostly water, and it has some electrolytes and some waste, some things that we don't need as much, and your body get rid of the excess. And of course, we lose a little bit of water, but not that much by respiration. Just by breathing, we lose a small amount of water. But the 3 areas that the total body water is distributed is plasma, interstitial space, and intracellular space. The interstitial space is, just to visualize, is the space that exists outside of the vasculature, so outside of the circulatory vessels, and also outside of the cells. So anything in between the cells, all the fluids we have under the skin in between cells, it's called interstitial space, and the water in that area is called interstitial water or interstitial fluids. The composition of the interstitial fluids is very, very similar to the plasma. So if you measure electrolytes, glucose, different things, it's very, very similar, very close to whatever we see in plasma. And that's why lately we have been trying to tap into those fluids to do some assessments and some measurements, that just because it's much easier to measure things in these fluids versus measuring in the plasma. So a good example is the continuous glucose monitoring systems, or the CGM, continuous glucose monitoring, where the monitor that we install usually on the back of the arm, it doesn't collect blood to analyze blood. It collects fluids from the interstitial space. And we say that the glucose content in the interstitial volume, it's about the same with plasma glucose, or almost the same. There are some transitions when we eat something super sweet. It will take some time to go from the plasma to the interstitial space, but overall, we get a good idea of what is your blood glucose. All right, let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit about this process and the distribution. This is just pretty much the same slide with a little bit more of a visual representation of the amount of water and how it is distributed. You can see that most of the water leaves within the cells, or what we call intracellular water. A relatively small amount is in the interstitial space, and a relatively very small amount of water in the plasma. The plasma, together with the interstitial space, we call it extracellular volume or extracellular water. And the water within the cells, we call it the intracellular water. Water can transfer from one compartment to the other, and there are different mechanisms. We have osmolality that can transfer fluids from a more diluted to a more concentrated space. We have pressure, so hydrostatic pressure, and the hydrostatic pressure in our body, we call it blood pressure. Our vasculature is pressurized. The arterial side, at least, is very pressurized. The venous side is not really pressurized. Actually, if we measure pressure in the veins, in the vena cava, when we lay down, it's very close to nothing, very close to zero. Actually, standing, the vena cava pressure, if you could measure in the vena cava, which is the main vein that receives all the venous blood coming back to the heart, the pressure is literally zero there. And then there is another system, which is, we call it different channels, actually, that we call them aquaporins. And aquaporins are also known as the water channels, and those water channels are responsible for transferring water between different tissues. And there are a lot of water channels, and you can see in this diagram we have even water channels in places that we think we don't have water, like bones, for example, inside the eye, in the kidneys, of course, that they are the major water balance regulators, uterus, and pancreas. Everywhere in our body we do have those aquaporin channels that are activated by a hormone that we will start talking just in the next slide. So this is a super simplified way to present how body fluids are regulated. And here we have the three different compartments. We have the plasma volume, it looks like a little tongue, the interstitial volume, and here we have the intracellular volume. So how these things get regulated? So when we drink something, the water goes in the plasma. From the plasma will be transferred in the interstitial space, and from the interstitial space will be transferred into the cells. So this is pretty much the process. When we get thirsty, we drink, so water goes in. And thirst, if you see those two little anchors here, what they represent two different things. They represent two theoretically sensors that they activate thirst. One of them is the sodium receptors or osmotic receptors. So when our blood gets a little bit thicker and the concentration of sodium goes up, or when we eat a lot of salty food and sodium content goes up, then we get thirsty, and as a response we drink more. When we get dehydrated, the plasma volume decreases as a volume, and here this sensor here represents a pressure sensor, that also known as baroreceptors. So the baroreceptors and the sodium or osmotic receptors are the two receptors that are responsible for activating thirst, and this is how we get thirsty. Excess of water will lead to dilution of sodium content and increase in in water content in the blood. So that will deactivate the baroreceptors and will also deactivate the osmotic receptors or the sodium receptors. And as a response, we will not be thirsty. And also that will increase the urinary output, which is primarily driven through suppression of arginine vasopressin. So arginine vasopressin is the same hormone that it's called antidiuretic hormone, ADH, or AVP, is the exact same hormone with two different names. So arginine vasopressin, what it does, it decreases urinary output, or more specifically, it decreases water reabsorption from the kidneys. So when AVP goes up, and it's also AVP is activated by the same mechanism that activates thirst, so osmolality and plasma volume, our urinary output decreases. If we drink more, those signals suppress vasopressin, and as a response, we pee more. So in a very, very, very simplified way, thirst and vasopressin are the two main regulators of body fluids. Let's see what happens when we do get dehydrated. So when somebody gets dehydrated, we have two separate responses that they tend to appear most of the time at the same, they appear at the same time. So we have increase in plasma osmolality. So all the constituencies of blood get more concentrated, and blood becomes a little bit thicker. If we could measure viscosity, for example, we will see that viscosity goes up. And we also see a decrease in plasma volume. And this is actually what primarily drives the increase in osmolality. It's not that suddenly more sodium shows up or more glucose shows up in the blood. It's just primarily we lose some water from the blood. And as a response, we have decrease in plasma volume and increase in osmolality. We also use the term hyperosmolality for increase in osmolality. And we use the term hypovolemia for decrease in plasma volume. Or we call it hyperosmotic hypovolemia. So hyperosmotic hypovolemia is a fancy way to say decrease in plasma volume and increase in osmolality. Then increase in osmolality activates the osmoreceptors that are pretty much everywhere in the body, including the GI system, the circulatory system, the brain, etc. And then increase in osmoreceptors activate the secretion of arginine vasopressin. As a response of increase in vasopressin, we have increase in water reabsorption from the kidney, and as a response, urine becomes very concentrated. So the urine that we produce is very concentrated, darker in color, and the total amount of urinary production decreases significantly. On the other side, the decrease in plasma volume, or hypovolemia, stimulates the baroreceptors, and the baroreceptors on the other side also activate the secretion of vasopressin. So now we have two different signals. We have the osmoreceptors that they stimulate vasopressin, and we also have the baroreceptors that stimulate vasopressin. So both of them say, let's get vasopressin, blood pressure is going to go down, and osmolality goes up. Let's retain water to avoid a significant dehydration. Another thing that happened as a response of the increase of the baroreceptor activation, we produce this hormone that is called angiotensin II. Angiotensin II has multiple effects. One of them is makes us thirsty, but one very important effect is stimulates the production of aldosterone. And what aldosterone does, increases the sodium reabsorption from the kidney. I assumed you might have heard that water follows sodium. So if sodium gets reabsorbed from the kidney, then water also helps to be reabsorbed. So it's another way that our body responds to dehydration. So increase in vasopressin and increase in aldosterone to hold as much as water that we have. Also, at the same time, the osmoreceptors make us thirsty, the baroreceptors make us thirsty, and angiotensin 2 also is one of the signals that stimulate thirst. So as a response, we get thirsty, assume that we have access to water, like we do in probably the 2/3 parts of the world. We do have running water anywhere, so we can find water to drink. You drink more, and that helps you to return to normal hydration. So even though we're going to dedicate an entire lecture talking about thirst and thirst regulation, let's see a little bit how thirst and vasopressin are stimulated. Already we discussed that plasma osmolality is the trigger, the signal, it's what drives vasopressin. And you see there is a nice linear relationship between plasma osmolality with plasma vasopressin. And if you pay attention to these numbers, it shows from, let's say, about 285 all the way to 305, which this is a physiological range of plasma osmolality. I guess you can go below that if you are in a water overload state, and if you had some kidney issues, you can also go much higher if you are severely dehydrated, whether it is exercise related or use of diuretics or lack of access to water, etc. So nice linear relationship between osmolality and vasopressin. If we draw the same line for plasma osmolality and thirst, you will see that also there is a nice linear relationship between thirst and plasma osmolality. What is interesting is if you superimpose those two and you see when vasopressin gets activated and when thirst is activated, you will see that there is a difference between the threshold of activation of vasopressin versus the threshold of activation of thirst. So what this thing means, it means that we first, when we start losing water, our body first responds by increasing vasopressin well before we get thirsty. That's why you might have heard that when you get thirsty, you are already dehydrated. People use this type of data to make this suggestion. So by any means, I'm not trying to say that thirst is not important and thirst is not very powerful. Thirst is one of the most powerful behavioral drives. When maximally stimulated in humans, the craving of water cannot be ignored and can become sufficiently intense to dominate all other thoughts and sensations. And what I'm trying to say with this quote from Gary Robertson is that when thirst gets maximally stimulated, when you're super thirsty, this is an intolerable situation. So yes, we don't get thirsty relatively easily, but when we get really thirsty, then we cannot function outside of let's go find water now. So it dominates all our thoughts and all our intentions. And I wrote a review paper talking about thirst, and I like to call thirst a survival instinct. So this is that intensity of thirst. It's a very strong survival instinct, but I think it's not a sensitive fluid balance homeostatic mechanism. It doesn't really tell us early on that we need to drink more water to stay optimally hydrated. So going back to this diagram with the two curves with vasopressin and thirst, if you pay attention, you will see that there is this range where you do have increase in vasopressin, but thirst is very low. And if you look carefully, you can see that you could be in that state where you're not thirsty, but you do have increase in vasopressin. And vasopressin could be somewhere between maybe 3 to 12 picogram per ml, which is a significant amount of vasopressin in the circulation. So I'll get back to this information because I'm trying to make a point. So going back to this funky diagram, that was developed actually many years ago by Ethan Adele and Gary Mack, that both of them were my postdoc mentors in Yale. This is the situation that you do have vasopressin stimulation, but you're not thirsty yet. And the only thing that you do see because of vasopressin is that you don't produce much urine, and when you produce urine, the urine is very concentrated, and it looks, what I like to say, more like an orange juice and less, or apple juice actually, it's probably a better description, and less like lemonade. So are there a lot of people being small drinkers and having very concentrated urine that indicate elevated vasopressin? This is a good question. We do have some data, at least for children, that are quite strong. Here we have data from children from the East Coast and West Coast, a significant number of children. And what they did in this study, they took morning urine sample and they measured urine osmolality. This range is pretty much the physiological range of humans from not zero. Zero means you pee 100% water. From, I would say, low 50s, maybe 30 something, 40, 50, all the way up to close to 1500 is the maximal ability of your body to concentrate urine and have very, very concentrated urine. So what they notice in this frequency diagram, the y-axis is number of children in this category. You will see that most children live in this area, which is above maybe 600-700 millimole of osmolality per kilogram of water, indicating that their kidneys are working very hard and they have nearly maximal urine osmolality. We'll talk a little bit more about what these numbers mean and what is a good hydration state, but definitely being above 5 or 6 or 700 is not, you're not well hydrated. And of course, looking at these numbers, which is 900, 1000, 1200, 1400 if you kids, it indicates that your kidneys are working so hard to reabsorb everything they can to prevent further water loss. Let me skip through that. We'll talk at a different point. In another study where they used National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey data from the US population representative sample, this is what they found for children specifically. More than 50% of children are underhydrated, and that was based on urine concentration that was over 800 millimole per kilogram of water content in the urine. So the urine osmolality was over 800. 1 in 4 children do not consume any plain water, and 3 out of 4 children consume more than one SSB or sugar sweetened beverage, sugary drink per day. So these are the quite unfortunate data, at least from the United States. What is the profile of those people that they are small drinkers? So this is an interesting study. They took adults, 250 adults, and from those 250, they selected the 100 subjects that they were either what they call the high drinkers or the low drinkers. So the top 50 subjects with the highest water intake and the bottom lower subjects with the lowest water intake. So this is what they noticed. They noticed that primarily there were 2 major things that was different between those 2 groups. The low drinkers had elevated vasopressin, and interestingly, they also had elevated cortisol. I'm not going to speak about cortisol today for sake of time, but we will talk about the why drinking small amount of water leads to elevated cortisol. So going back to the paradigm again, that my favorite figure here, what happens when you have high vasopressin, but you're not thirsty? So is it okay to have chronically elevated vasopressin? And vasopressin has 2 two names and two main functions that most people are aware of. So one function is what we called vasopressin, so pressing the vasculature. So it stimulates increasing blood pressure. So when you get dehydrated, instead of dropping your blood pressure, vasopressin can help you maintain your blood pressure, and you'll have less of a negative impact of dehydration. So this is where the name vasopressin came from. And the antidiuretic means you decrease urinary output. It's antidiuretic effect. So those are the two main things we know about vasopressin, that it has an impact on blood pressure regulation and it has an impact on urinary output. However, more recently we have learned that vasopressin has a lot of other actions outside of the classic ones. Outside of the homeostasis and blood pressure regulation, we have metabolic syndrome, chronic kidney disease, cellular proliferation, hypertension, cognition, infection, bone health, pain, social behavior, believe it or not, lipid metabolism, aging, inflammation, etc. So we'll talk a little bit more throughout the semester, but vasopressin really has a lot of other impacts. So the question that I like to go back and ask people is it okay to live with high AVP constantly if you're a small drinker, if you don't drink a lot of water? And the answer is not, or it is as okay as it was smoking some years ago. I don't know if you have really seen any of those slides before of those advertisements. Those were back in the 50s, that they were saying that if you smoke, and Philip Morris specifically, you will have a better delivery if you're a pregnant woman, born gently. There is scientific data that indicate that nicotine decreases blood flow to the fetus, and the embryo doesn't grow as much. So mothers that they smoke, they give birth to smaller babies. So it's easier to give birth, born gently. If you like Winston, it's a win-win-win situation. Easy labor, slim baby, full flavor of Winston. Who could not resist in that? I hope you're laughing by now, or you're getting angry, one of those two. But those were true advertisements back in the 50s. And I don't know how many of you have seen the Netflix series Bad Men. And at the beginning, I think, of that show, they talk about the interaction of the marketing company with the tobacco industry and what ideas they had. And they even talk specifically for the embryo size. So going back to my favorite question, is it okay to live with high vasopressin? Hopefully by the end of the semester, I will convince you that it is not okay. So we have a lot of data, and this is an area that I'm research active, and I really like this area, which is the impact of low water intake on glucose regulation, diabetes development, metabolic syndrome, etc. So we'll talk extensively towards the end of the semester more about this data. Also, low water intake is associated with kidney disease and chronic kidney disease, deterioration in acute ischemic stroke, dehydration and mood. It's something that is very interesting. We have published some data, and other scientists have published data. There are data on longevity, endothelial function. We did some work on cardiovascular system and hydration. So I think vasopressin is a great thing that can be secreted, and it can help us to regulate body fluid. But living in high levels of vasopressin constantly, it comes with a very high cost. So I'm going to stop here by giving you a positive note to think about, which is, how about if drinking water is an easy and a cost-effective way to improve health and well-being? So we'll talk more about all these things. I hope you enjoyed the first part of the introduction and hydration. If you got a little bit confused with the physiology and the the hormonal regulation, go back and listen to this part again, and I will explain a little bit more about vasopressin, aldosterone, and their impact in kidney in the video coming right after this. Thank you.